Jennifer Washburn looks at the relationship between corporate America and higher education in her new book, University, Inc. She spoke recently at the University of Maryland in College Park. This program runs 45 minutes.
Good afternoon. It is, first of all, let me welcome all of you to this afternoon's talk by Ms. Jennifer Washburn. We are honored, and it's a privilege to have you at the University of Maryland campus. Rest assured that the university commits none of the breaches that you mentioned in any of your publications, so we're even more happy to have you with us. Also, on a personal note, for me, is a distinct honor to introduce you as someone who studies ethics in both the public and private sector. Ms. Washburn is a freelance journalist and fellow at the New American Foundation. She's the author of several books and articles. Her most recent book is entitled University, Inc., and she wrote an award-winning article from the National Association of Science Writers called The Kept University. Provocative titles of some of her other publications include Selling Out, Hired Education, The Tuition Crunch, and Digital Diplomas. Ms. Washburn's scholarly work and research focus on the growing privatization of the public sphere, including the commercialization of higher education, a topic that I know is near and dear to all of our hearts in this room. The reviews of University, Inc. have characterized this publication as the most important contribution to the debate on the future of higher education. So congratulations again on this contribution. Some of the topics that she includes in many of her publications include the ethics controversies around publicly funded scientists moonlighting as paid consultants that manufacture the very drugs that these companies are testing. And universities are on slippery slope as they behave as research arms of some of these private industries. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the University of Maryland. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a very kind, generous introduction. Thank you. Well, thanks to all of you for coming out. It's really makes it much more fun to do these events when lots of students and faculty do come out, because what really interests me is to really spark discussion and of these issues. So that's really why I wrote the book. So it's great that you're here. I thought I would start by just reading a very short section from the book, just to give you a little feel for what it reads like, and then I'd sort of do a more overview kind of discussion of the larger issues that I sort of take on in the book. So this comes from Chapter 1. On the afternoon of April 13th, 1999, a radiant spring day, the Berkeley campus hardly looked like the site of a raging controversy. Sproul Plaza was bustling with activity. Students tossed frisbees, basked in the sunshine on lush green lawns. But inside room 60 of Evans Hall, the lights were dim and the atmosphere was tense and polarized. There, some 24 faculty members, mostly professors in the College of Natural Resources, had gathered to hear the disquieting results of a newly released faculty survey. The focus of the survey was a controversial agreement that Berkeley had signed in November 1998 with Novartis, a Swiss-based pharmaceutical giant and producer of genetically engineered crops. Roughly 2 years into the agreement, Novartis's agricultural division merged with another company to become Syngenta. Despite this name change, however, I'll continue to refer to the collaboration as the Berkeley-Novartis Alliance. Under the terms of the agreement, Novartis gave Berkeley $25 million over 5 years to fund basic research in the Department of Plant and Microbial Biology, one of 4 departments within the College of Natural Resources. In exchange for the $25 million, Berkeley granted Novartis first rights to negotiate licenses on roughly 1/3 of the department's discoveries, including the results of research funded by Novartis, as well as projects funded by state and federal sources. It also granted the company unprecedented representation, 2 of 5 seats on the company's research committee, which determined how the money would be spent. That the university had secured funding from a private company was hardly unusual. That a single corporation would provide 1/3 of the research budget for an entire department at a public university had sparked an uproar. Shortly after the agreement was signed, a newly formed graduate student group, Students for Responsible Research, circulated a petition blasting the agreement for, quote, standing in direct conflict with our mission as a public university. The Daily Californian, Berkeley's student newspaper, published a 5-part series on the growing privatization of the university, and a coalition of public interest groups sent a letter to Berkeley's chancellor, Robert Berdahl, charging that the alliance would, quote, disqualify a leading intellectual center from the ranks of institutions able to provide the kind of research free from vested interest that is the hallmark of academic life. Meanwhile, Gordon Rausser, the dean of the College of Natural Resources, sent a message to all professors urging them not to speak to the press and to direct any questions about the agreement to the university's public relations office. Many viewed the memo as a hush order. We are here to discuss the position of the faculty, Ignacio Chapela, a professor of microbial ecology, announced at the April 13th meeting. Chapela, who was then serving as the elected chairman of the college's executive committee, a faculty governing body, snapped on an overhead projector to display the results of the survey. The Novartis agreement has left the College of Natural Resources deeply divided, he declared. Although 41% of the faculty respondents supported the agreement as signed, more than 50% believed that it would have a negative or strongly negative effect on academic freedom. Roughly half believed that the agreement would erode Berkeley's commitment to, quote, public good research. And 60% feared that it would impede the free exchange of ideas among scientists within the college, one of Chapela's own concerns. When I came to Berkeley, Chapela explained to me after the meeting, the people who brought me here were my closest colleagues. The people who brought me here and who were my closest colleagues were largely in the Department of Plant and Microbial Biology. Now I know that anything I say to these people can be turned around and handed over to Novartis. So I just can't talk to them anymore. If I have a good idea, I'm not going to just give it away. Chapela, like many critics of the deal, is hardly a confirmed opponent of university-industry relations. Before coming to Berkeley, he worked for none other than Novartis, then named Sandoz. And afterward, he continued to have a relationship with the company. I'm not opposed to individual professors serving as consultants to industry, he emphasized. If something goes wrong, it's their reputation that's at stake, but this is different. This deal institutionalizes the university's relationship with one company whose interest is profit. Our role should be to serve the public good. The Berkeley-Novartis agreement was not the first major alliance between a prominent university and a private corporation. As early as 1974, Harvard Medical School signed a $23.5 million agreement with Monsanto to perform research on cancer tumors. In 1983, Columbia University entered into a multi-million-dollar deal with Bristol Myers. And there were many more such deals that followed. Yet there is a reason the Novartis agreement touched a particularly raw nerve. For to many people in the academic world, the agreement seemed to mark the culmination of a deeper transformation in which far more was at stake than the fate of one academic department. The agreement came at a time of mounting evidence that commercial criteria were defining the terms of academic life. Sorry, I've actually lost my place here. Take, for example, the comments of Professor J. Patrick Kelly, the Kmart chair of marketing at Wayne State University, who told the Chronicle of Higher Education, Kmart's attitude has always been, what did we get from you this year? Some professors would say they don't like that position, but for me, it's kept me involved with a major retailer, and it's been a good thing. At Berkeley itself, buildings increasingly bore the names of corporate donors. Industry-sponsored research was ubiquitous, and even academic titles were changing, with Laura Dandria Tyson, a former top Clinton advisor, known as the Bank America Dean of the Haas School of Business. What's more, the Novartis Agreement surfaced at a time when whole new areas of public life, from schools to social services to prisons, were being privatized. The public sector appeared to be shrinking and was possibly even becoming endangered. If one of the nation's preeminent public universities was willing to lease out its reputation and prestige in this way, where would other institutions draw the line? Was it right to ask California taxpayers to finance a higher education system that effectively granted a foreign-based multinational monopoly control over its research? Such concerns spilled well beyond the Berkeley campus, too. The Novartis-Berkeley deal can all too easily be portrayed as an institution undermining both its motivation and its trustworthiness to provide an independent and impartial view of the most contentious technologies of our time, genetically modified crops, wrote the prestigious science journal Nature in an editorial titled, "Is the University Industrial Complex Out of Control?" I should have made that clear, that whole last quote there. The Novartis-Berkeley deal can all too easily be portrayed as an institution undermining both its motivation and trustworthiness. That all came from this Nature editorial. So I didn't read that terribly well, but I hope that it conveyed a little bit the flavor of sort of what's happening on various different university campuses. The Novartis-Berkeley agreement was the first sort of controversy on a university campus that I tried to cover. And when I went there, the faculty survey had just been released, and the campus was really in an uproar. It really prompted me to ask a number of questions about what is really happening to these institutions. And so in the rest of my talk, I think I'll just try to lay out a little bit what my arguments are about what's going on. Historically, U.S. universities have always vigorously defended their academic freedom, and they've vigorously fought to preserve their independence from outside interest groups, whether they're religious, political, or commercial. What we've seen recently, I would say in the last 25 years, is that universities are drawing more and more of their funding from private industry. Since 1980, there's been about an 8% increase in industry support for academic research. It's risen about 8% annually, reaching $2 billion in 2001. And the problem is that this money comes with strings attached. Increasingly, industry is requiring delays on publication. There's growing secrecy. There are growing proprietary restrictions on the research. And universities themselves are allowing industry to control the raw data from clinical trials. So there's an extraordinary extent to which industry is able to manipulate and control the terms of the research. So how prevalent is this problem? There was a survey recently of 800 scientific papers published in a range of biomedical journals, and it found that about 1/3 of the authors had a significant financial interest in their own research. When I say a significant financial interest, that could be anything from holding a patent to the drug that's being tested, having equity stakes in the company funding the research, or holding an executive position in the company. So the other problem is it's not simply that universities are drawing more of their funding from industry, but in fact that universities themselves are starting to look and behave more like commercial entities. What do I mean by that? Well, universities now, research universities throughout the country now run their own industrial parks. They run their own venture capital funds. They run very extensive patenting and licensing operations to commercialize their research and license it to industry in exchange for royalty income. Increasingly universities are investing their own endowment money in quite risky startup ventures that are launched by their own professors. There was a very famous case at Boston University where Boston University invested about a fifth of its endowment, approximately $85 million, in a startup company called Saragen that was founded by its own professors. The university's president actually himself invested in this. He encouraged trustees to invest in the company. And finally, when the company's financial situation deteriorated, the university was accused of egregiously mismanaging the university's endowment in order to prop up the company. So those kinds of financial conflicts are really unprecedented, and it's a kind of commercial activity on the part of the university that is significant. So why is all this happening? Well, in my book, I spend a lot of time looking at the various different forces that converged to create this situation. But here I'll just talk about a few. One is obviously cutbacks in public support for higher education. I'm sure a lot of people in this room are quite aware of this. Most of the state-funded universities have experienced serious financial strain. Since 1980, there has been the share of state budgets that goes to fund higher education has dropped by approximately 1/3. At many universities now that used to receive about 50% of their funding from the state now receive only 30% or less. The University of Virginia, remarkably, receives about 8% of its funding from the state of Virginia. So understandably, university administrators are feeling a lot of financial squeeze. So that's one explanation. The other explanation is that in the latter part of the 1970s, the United States was experiencing serious rising competition from Germany and Japan. We were facing a lot of economic stagnation. And the U.S. Congress decided to pass a legislation known as the Bayh-Dole Act. It was named after Senators Birch Bayh and Bob Dole. This legislation, although many of us don't know much about it, is a really important part of the book, and I try to give a very lively kind of description of how it got passed because it's fascinating. The various different forces that came together and the evidence on which it was based, which, by the way, was very flimsy. So the idea of this legislation was essentially this: we're going to give universities automatic rights, automatic intellectual property rights to federally funded research, and will allow those universities to license that research to private industry in exchange for royalties. The idea was that this would give universities a financial incentive to move academic research out of the laboratory into the commercial marketplace more quickly. And it was thought that this would spur innovation. So, you know, a lot of people have been singing the praises of the Bayh-Dole Act, but what the Bayh-Dole Act never really envisioned, and it's remarkable when you go back and look at the hearings and the congressional hearings, to see that there was absolutely no attention paid to what this might do to the university as an institution. So I've talked a bit about how important the independence of the university is. Now the university had a direct financial interest in its own professors' research. And this is really unprecedented. U.S. universities have long had relationships with private industry. They've long had a role to play in transferring academic inventions to industry, and all of this is a good thing. And I certainly believe that universities should have collaborations with the private sector. But now you had the university itself trying to profit off of its own research, and you opened up a huge Pandora's box. So what happened? Essentially, universities started to try to justify themselves to state legislators and governors, and the governors in turn expected universities to serve as engines of economic growth. Suddenly, it wasn't enough for the university to teach the undergraduates. It wasn't enough for them to focus on training top-notch scientists and new world leaders and teach people to think creatively and independently. It wasn't enough for them to produce academic research that would then be transferred to industry and then be commercialized. The university itself was supposed to play a more direct role in spinning off startup companies, generating high-tech jobs, and literally creating the next Silicon Valley in their own backyard, much as Stanford had been able to do and MIT. So this is a little bit of a digression, but when you actually look at how Silicon Valley and Route 128 got created, it turns out that the university did not play a direct role in creating those high technology centers around those universities. Yes, it was very important that they spun off all of this incredible talent, mostly in the form of talented students and people who left the university to start those companies. But they didn't actually play a direct commercial role themselves. And now, because of this blurring of the lines between commercial and academic, universities see it as their role to engage in these commercial activities to a degree that we've not seen in the past. So why is all this bad? I mean, we obviously want to see academic research transferred to industry. We want to see companies benefit from that research, and so that we can all profit from the products that they manufacture. The problem, as I see it, is really threefold. One is that it erodes the university's capacity to serve the public interest. It confuses what the role of the university is in our society, and we really have to ask. We have to ask, to what extent do we want universities to be accountable to the public or to the private interest? The conflicts of interest that I've alluded to that have arisen are really very serious. increasingly, there have been a number of scandals that we've all read about with Vioxx and the various antidepressant drugs. Turns out that academic scientists stand behind much of the research that brought those drugs to the public. In the past, academic investigators played a very, very important role in performing these clinical drug studies to make sure that these drugs were safe and to perform that research independently of the drug industry. Now, increasingly, industry's hands are all over the research, and universities are not defending their academic freedom enough. Many university contracts allow the drug companies to control the raw data from these clinical trials. That makes it very, very difficult for the academic investigator to truly hold on to his own autonomy and publish the research as he sees fit. Literally, the drug company can say, well, you don't have access to the complete clinical trial data, therefore you can't say what the outcome of this study was. So professors are becoming complicit by signing their names to research papers, lending them an aura of prestige. A professor of Harvard signs on to a drug study financed by Bristol-Myers, and there's no evidence necessarily that Bristol-Myers lay behind that study, and yet that academic cannot actually vouch for the research that was finally published. This became such a problem that various medical journal editors have now come out with very serious books critiquing what's happening to medicine, and academic medicine in particular. The editor of The Lancet, the British medical journal, actually went so far as to say that academic medical journals have become little more than money laundering operations for the drug industry, meaning that the drug industry finances the study, but it's published under the name of a prestigious academic. It looks as if it's been conducted independently, but in fact it's a foil for the drug industry's spin. So how does this affect us? Even the antidepressants that were recently pulled off the market, it turns out that academic scientists had conducted a lot of the early original research that had suggested that these antidepressants were perfectly safe for children and teenagers. But when the FDA went back and looked at the raw data from those clinical trials, they found that it wasn't in fact consistent with what these academics had published in their own research. Then you go back and you look at the academic scientists who published those papers, and you find out that nearly all of the lead authors had very significant financial ties to the antidepressant manufacturers. So if the university becomes commercialized in this way, clearly we lose one of our centers of independent critical thought in this country, and that's very troubling. I really want to make sure that we keep focused also. This is not just about the sciences. This is also really concerns students, I think, very directly. We've always had a problem in this country that there's been a tension between research and teaching. But it's my argument that this commercialization of higher education has exacerbated this problem. What do I mean by that? Well, at the same time that universities are pouring resources into these new patenting and licensing offices, many of which are not even profitable, they're actually eliminating full-time professorships and increasingly relying on part-time graduate students and adjuncts to handle most of the undergraduate instruction. At the same time that universities are charging tuition higher tuition prices than ever before, partly because of cutbacks in state support, you're seeing that undergraduate education is really undervalued. The entire core humanities disciplines are being underfunded. More and more, the resources of the university go to the fields, the subjects that make money, study money, or attract money. The salaries of professors are increasingly tied to how much money the faculty can actually bring into the university. In the past, it certainly was not the case that salary levels were relatively equal. It was believed that your salary should be based on intellectual standing. Now, increasingly, if you're a mathematician who won one of the most prestigious prizes in mathematics, the field medal, you might be paid the same salary as someone just a few years out of a PhD in an economics department, simply because the economics department is a more lucrative discipline. So to the extent that universities send out that message that what matters, what has value, is actually the almighty dollar and not intellectual accomplishments, that is a very disturbing trend. And I think it is bad for students. I think it sends entirely the wrong message that universities have downsized teaching so significantly. The last thing, and then I want to open it up for questions, and is to just talk about what the effect is on the U.S. innovation system. Interestingly, the Bayh-Dole Act was passed ostensibly to spur innovation, but increasingly, and it's something that I show in the book, I interview various different economists, historians of scientific innovation who are very troubled by what's happening. The Bayh-Dole Act encouraged universities to patent their research even when it was very basic research. And this is troubling because often basic research, its greatest value is in its ability to spur new research. It wants to be free. It wants to be broadly available. And when universities patent that research and license it restrictively, they actually impede innovation. There's a really wonderful example that's pretty telling from the University of Utah. When the University of Utah, a professor there discovered the human gene that's responsible for hereditary breast cancer. The university didn't make that research broadly available as it would in the past. That research was funded with about $4.6 million of taxpayer funding. Yet the university licensed the research exclusively to Myriad Genetics, which is a startup company that was founded by the inventor. And Myriad Genetics then proceeded to hoard the gene and prevent other academic scientists throughout the United States and throughout the world from gaining access to it. They charged, exorbitant fees to access it, and essentially many researchers concluded they simply couldn't continue their work on breast cancer research because this critical this gene responsible for hereditary breast cancer had been patented. So we're seeing really troubling developments like that. That happened with stem cells. It's happened with genetically modified mice. Very basic building blocks of science that are being privatized and made proprietary in such a way that people who are concerned about the pipeline for innovation believe that it could stifle future innovation. So to me, that's actually one of the most troubling aspects of this, because universities historically have played a critical role in defending the public domain for knowledge. Their most important function was we always hear about publish or perish. Well, what does that really mean? Publish or perish is about broad dissemination of your research. What has value is to make it available to the public. So when universities start to treat their research as if it was proprietary, and they don't understand the broader needs of scientific advancement in the innovation system, that's deeply troubling, because this is the only area where research is performed in a non-proprietary way. And even industry experts are troubled by this. And interestingly, I have a quote from the Stanley Williams at Hewlett-Packard, one of their top scientists, who recently testified before Congress, complaining that the Bayh-Dole Act has made universities patent hungry and overly aggressive. And basically, Hewlett-Packard has now decided that they might have to export most of their basic research that they used to fund, that they used to spend at U.S. universities. They want to export it over to Chinese universities and universities in Europe. Why? Because they don't have these aggressive patenting and licensing provisions. And Hewlett-Packard finds that it's such an impediment to their being able to use the research and actually use it profitably in their own commercial work that they don't want to deal with U.S. universities. So when you start to hear complaints like that coming from industry, I certainly think that that's a wake-up call, that the Bayh-Dole Act might need to seriously be modified. So on all those grounds, I think given you more than enough to open some discussion. Thank you. I don't know, I'm just going to ask and see if anybody wants to plunge with the first question. Yeah.
Well, let me just make a couple of remarks I've heard around campus. Number one, of course, the modern university, their appetite for funds is insatiable. Number two, I will quote a colleague of mine who once pointed out that the basic difference between this university and a brothel is, in a brothel there are certain things they won't do for money. So do you have any remedies for this? Or?
Yeah, I do propose lots of remedies. Yeah, universities are getting a bad rap from all sides, and I want to make it clear. I think they're our most vital institutions, and so I do have recommendations, but I think it's easy to get so cynical that we don't even focus on what really needs to be fixed here. So I think that we need much more stringent conflict of interest rules. I think that the federal government, recently the NIH decided that it would impose much more stringent conflict of interest rules on its own scientists because they suddenly discovered that their scientists were off moonlighting as consultants for the very drug companies that were manufacturing the drugs that they study at the NIH. So what is the point of having a taxpayer-funded, independent government agency that's supposed to be serving the public interest that is in fact moonlighting for the drug industry on the side? So the NIH imposed stricter conflict of interest rules. They banned that kind of outside consulting. And I think that it's only logical that if academic investigators are receiving funding from the federal government and from the NIH, they too should have to comply with much stricter conflict of interest rules. Unfortunately, every time that has come up as an issue, it came up in 1989 due to glaring conflicts of interest at universities, and it came up again in early 2000. The university establishment, the university leadership fought tooth and nail to stop the federal government from imposing conflict of interest rules. Why? Because they wanted to defend academic freedom. So I find it ironic that that the university suddenly cry, defense of academic freedom when their conflicts of interest have become so pervasive. What they argue is that they want to be left to handle their conflict of interest rules themselves. But the problem is the rules are so, each institution has its own rules, and there's a race to the bottom in standards. No one wants to impose tougher rules than the other school because they're afraid that the better scientists will leave to schools that have looser conflict of interest rules. So we really need a federal system of conflict of interest rules. That's one proposal among many.
How often do you find that your top researchers leave the university because they don't want to be restricted and just go to work for the private company?
Well, unfortunately, I think what's happened is that universities are desperate to, in the past that might have been, a certain number of professors may have decided to go into the private sector, but the universities would have said, okay, then go. Perhaps you might come back at a future time. But now they're trying to have it both ways. The professor's becoming a professor entrepreneur. He has his startup company on the side. He's very heavily involved in that company. He's also trying to teach graduate students. In my book, I have some incredible examples of graduate students at Stanford University who left, two very, very talented students who had received all kinds of honors and accolades, who literally left their professor's lab because they felt that he was so conflicted. His commercial interests in his own company were compromising their own ability to finish their PhDs. Literally, some of their research migrated over to the company without their knowledge, and they were very upset about it, and the university did not respond, in my view, from my research and investigations of the case, they did not respond adequately. So suddenly these students' PhD research wound up in a company presentation that was being showed to investors at the professor's startup company without their knowledge. And that was unpublished research, it hadn't been verified, and it was research that they had hoped to publish as part of their academic studies. So, these kinds of conflicts are arising all over the place because it becomes increasingly difficult to determine who owns the research that's being performed in these academic labs. Increasing fights between faculty and universities and students over the right to commercially valuable inventions. There's an amazing case at the University of South Florida where the university actually filed suit against a master's student, Peter Taborski, who discovered a promising way to remove ammonia from wastewater, a commercially promising way to do that. And both the university and the company that had been sponsoring the professor's lab essentially filed suit against him. He was accused of stealing university property, and literally the case became such an embarrassment that the governor of the the state of Florida had to intervene and grant him clemency. So this is unprecedented. We haven't seen that kind of commercial battles going on in universities. But I think we really need to think through, perhaps if faculty do have research that they absolutely need to be involved in commercially in order to bring it to commercial fruition, then they should be able to take an extended sabbatical away from school, but there shouldn't be this bleeding of academic and commercial activities that we're seeing today. Yeah.
What does the university administration, who's more strapped for cash, do to get the funds necessary?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really complicated question. I mean, I think this goes back to your point that you know, it is also a question of what the university's priorities are. You know, is it necessary to have a movie theater on campus for the students? Is it necessary? I mean, maybe you guys love it, maybe it's great, but there are certain questions of priorities. How fancy and elaborate does the campus gym have to be? You know, where is the university putting its money, and what are its real priorities? Is it to pay full-time teachers to teach undergraduates, or is it to finance these patenting and licensing offices that, as I show in my book, the vast majority of the university patenting and licensing activities are barely breaking even. So they're pouring money into this activity to justify themselves to state legislators and to governors to show that they have that they're doing something that's good for business. But in fact, most of these patenting and licensing operations are not money makers. So, you know, but they're pouring money into hiring these patent lawyers. They're very expensive operations. And so a lot of it is a question of priorities, too. And I think that universities have to do a better job of going to their legislators and explaining what they have traditionally done so well and why those traditional functions are being jeopardized by this increasing pressure to grow more commercialized. If they don't defend the core functions that they perform and justify those to the legislature, you know, then I think that they're going to lose the battle to persuade the legislature why it is that a public university does need to be publicly funded. Any other questions from students? Or yeah, sorry, I'll take you and then you next.
Well, I read a book on this subject that dealt with research into heart medicine, and the company that was doing this had an interest in getting the medicine on the market because they're going to make a huge amount of money since they didn't have any competition for this. But it turns out that people were dying as a result of using this medicine, and the research wasn't being done to show that the medicine was killing the people. It wasn't helping to keep them alive. No. So this is a kind of lethality that can get involved here. Yeah. Because you don't have somebody who says, well, I want to find out what's really going on. You know, I think that, and you get people in the university who are employed, you know, by the company and working in the university, but their allegiance is to the company because the company is paying them so much money.
Right, right. No, you know, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's hard to understate the significance. I mean, when medical research is commercially driven, it can have profoundly dangerous effects for human health. You know, people take these drugs and they depend on them and they're sick. And you know, there's an incredible case at the University of Pennsylvania when this young man died in a gene therapy experiment at the University of Pennsylvania. You know, the father was completely distraught. This young man had volunteered altruistically for this clinical trial at the university to test it was a very rare liver disorder, and I'm forgetting the exact name of it at the moment, but essentially, it turned out that the university and the lead investigator had a financial interest in the clinical drug study. And that only came to light after the FDA started investigating his death, and also discovered that the university had egregiously violated a number of the federal rules designed to protect human subjects. I mean, enormous discrepancies and violations of federal rules to protect human subjects. So, you know, we can't prove that the university scientists shirked their scientific duty to protect the patients because of their financial interests, but certainly it did not look good. And it raises questions about whether they might have, you know, done more shoddy research because they were so eager to show that the drug was successful that they didn't actually take in consideration how the patient was actually doing. And so those kinds of financial conflicts can have financial conflicts of interest can have life and death consequences. I'm just going to ask, you.
How much do you think textbooks are being affected?
Textbooks, you know, I know that that's a huge area. I know that textbook prices have gone up enormously. I think I recently read something that they had gone up about 60% in the last decade or so. I'm sure that it sounds like you probably know more about this than I do. Are there issues coming up in the textbook arena?
I read medical stuff, and I just see stuff that's a little surprising that where it's written and not what's suppressed and what's selectively, what's left out.
Yeah.
Even in Google, some stuff doesn't come forward. It should come forward. Mm-hmm. And so I see there's energy going into controlling what's in our free press, let's say. Yeah. In our free orange.
Well, I think, you know, it's quite clear. There are a number of there's a lot of research now that shows that when research is industry funded, it is significantly more likely to reach conclusions that favor the industry's interests than research that's nonprofit funded or government funded. So that bias is there. I mean, and we're seeing very, very serious suppression of academic research as well. We've had cases where an AIDS researcher at the University of California at San Francisco tried to publish research on an AIDS drug, showing that the AIDS drug was no more effective than a placebo, and he was slapped with a $7 to $10 million lawsuit by the corporate sponsor, and the university had to deal with that. So there are very overt forms of suppression of research going on, but also much more subtle versions. Yeah.
Well, I think an interesting area it has to do with NIH. I think back in 1973, they decided out there in the National Institute of Mental Health that they would no longer consider homosexuality to be psychopathological, and that they would have the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual changed so that it would not list homosexuality as psychopathological. You know, just take it out of there. And however, it is psychopathological, and it's an area where you don't have to deal with the genes because it's not genetic. You know, so it's not a medical problem. You know, it doesn't derive from genes like other maladies. Well, then along came the AIDS crisis, you know, and all of this stuff about, well, we've got to have, you know, wide open society and so on. But you know, this is an area where I think some attention needs to be spent, and it's not, you know, a strictly medical area, but it's a social, psychological area. And if you don't deal with it, things are getting worse. The AIDS, for instance, seems to be metamorphizing into, you know, a worse form of AIDS.
I'm not totally clear what this has to do, though, with the commercial sort of aspect of it. But
well, if you're going to say, yeah, but I mean, if you're going to say that there's nothing wrong, that these people are just doing their thing and that it's equal or equivalent to somebody else's behavior, you know, and you're not going to pay any attention to it, then what you're doing is you're really encouraging the medical pathology related to AIDS. You're encouraging the social pathology. I mean, you want somebody to...
I'm gonna cut you off. Sorry, but I mean, I think it's obviously a huge issue, but not really related to this at hand. But listen, I mean, there's many things we could talk about on that front. But yeah.
Well, let's get back to this business. Now, you said very correctly that when the university goes to the state to ask for some money, their argument is basically 100% economic growth. Now what they mean by that is not so much the things you're talking about, but they're training people in IT or training technical people, more or less. They pay lip service to liberal arts and the idea of, quote, an educated citizenry, but they don't really believe it.
Right.
And they and this is why you see that certain fields are paid more than other fields.
Yeah. No, I think there is the humanities are really struggling to hold their own in this increasingly this atmosphere where increasingly students are treated like consumers and research is a product, and everybody wants to know what the economic dividend is, because if you're just looking for a short-term economic dividend, the humanities are always going to lose out. But I actually have a wonderful quote from the Federal Reserve Chairman Greenspan, who just has the most eloquent defense of a liberal arts education, and I put it in the book. But you know, he spoke about the fact that increasingly what we need in this new information-driven economy, more than anything, is for students to be able to think critically and creatively, and to be able to express themselves, and that where our true competitive edge is going to lie is in our intellectual faculties. And certainly he talks very eloquently about how the humanities have traditionally done a remarkably good job of stimulating that kind of critical thinking and creativity of thought. And so if we, you know, I think that is sort of the bigger message. Maybe I'll end on this, that the bigger message of the book is that sometimes we don't realize where the true economic value of our education lies. I interviewed one of the founders of the biotechnology revolution, a man named Paul Berg at Stanford, who spoke about the fact that when they were doing all the initial research that led to the biotechnology revolution, the venture capitalists weren't interested in it. Nobody in industry was interested in it. It didn't seem to have any commercial value at the time. It seemed to be very abstract, sort of curiosity-driven research that had no commercial utility. And then, lo and behold, it gave birth to the biotechnology revolution. And so he expresses real concern about whether or not, if the university becomes commercially oriented, whether it will be able to support the kind of basic curiosity-driven research that will drive the next biotechnology revolution. And so we must be careful not to downplay the significance of this independent academic sphere that is not driven by commercial forces, because it's all of those areas that are likely to give fruit in unexpected ways. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Jennifer Washburn has written for Atlantic Monthly, The Washington Post, and The Nation. University Inc. is published by Basic Books, online at basicbooks.com. Mona Cherry.
The people who brought me here and who were my closest colleagues were largely in the Department of Plant and Microbial Biology. Now I know that anything I say to these people can be turned around and handed over to Novartis. So I just can't talk to them anymore. If I have a good idea, I'm not going to just give it away. Chappella, like many critics of the deal, is hardly a confirmed opponent of university-industry relations. Before coming to Berkeley, he worked for none other than Novartis, then named Sandoz. And afterward, he continued to have a relationship with the company. I'm not opposed to individual professors serving as consultants to industry, he emphasized. If something goes wrong, it's their reputation that's at stake. But this is different. This deal institutionalizes the university's relationship with one company whose interest is profit. Our role should be to serve the public good. The Berkeley-Novartis Agreement was not the first major alliance between a prominent university and a private corporation. As early as 1974, Harvard Medical School signed a $23.5 million agreement with Monsanto to perform research on cancer tumors. In 1983, Columbia University entered into a multi-million-dollar deal with Bristol-Myers. And there were many more such deals that followed. Yet there is a reason the Novartis Agreement touched a particularly raw nerve. For to many people in the academic world, the agreement seemed to mark the culmination of a deeper transformation in which far more was at stake than the fate of one academic department. The agreement came at a time of mounting evidence that commercial criteria were defining the terms of academic life. Sorry, I've actually lost my place here. In controversy, Sproul Plaza was bustling with activity. Students tossed frisbees, basked in the sunshine on lush green lawns. But inside room 60 of Evans Hall, the lights were dim and the atmosphere was tense and polarized. There, some 24 faculty members, mostly professors in the College of Natural Resources, had gathered to hear the disquieting results of a newly released faculty survey. The focus of the survey was a controversial agreement that Berkeley had signed in November 1998 with Novartis, a Swiss-based pharmaceutical giant and producer of genetically engineered crops. Roughly 2 years into the agreement, Novartis's agricultural division merged with another company to become Syngenta. Despite this name change, however, I'll continue to refer to the collaboration as the Berkeley-Novartis Alliance. Under the terms of the agreement, Novartis gave Berkeley $25 million over 5 years to fund basic research in the Department of Plant and Microbial Biology, one of 4 departments within the College of Natural Resources. In exchange for the $25 million, Berkeley granted Novartis first rights to negotiate licenses on roughly 1/3 of the department's discoveries, including the results of research funded by Novartis, as well as projects funded by state and federal sources. It also granted the company unprecedented representation, 2 of 5 seats on the company's research committee, which determined how the money would be spent. That the university had secured funding from a private company was hardly unusual. That a single corporation would provide 1/3 of the research budget for an entire department at a public university had sparked an uproar. Shortly after the agreement was signed, a newly formed graduate
Jennifer Washburn looks at the relationship between corporate America and higher education in her new book, University Inc. She spoke recently at the University of Maryland in College Park. This program runs 45 minutes.
Good afternoon. First of all, let me welcome all of you to this afternoon's talk by Ms. Jennifer Washburn. We are honored, and it's a privilege to have you at the University of Maryland campus. Rest assured that the university commits none of the breaches that you mentioned in any of your publications, so we're even more happy to have you with us. Also, on a personal note, for me, is a distinct honor to introduce you as someone who studies ethics in both the public and private sector. Ms. Washburn is a freelance journalist and fellow at the New American Foundation. She's the author of several books and articles. Her most recent book is entitled University Inc., and she wrote an award-winning article from the National Association of Science Writers called The Kept University. Provocative titles of some of her other publications include Selling Out, Hired Education, The Tuition Crunch, and Digital Diplomas. Ms. Washburn's scholarly work and research focus on the growing privatization of the public sphere, including the commercialization of higher education, a topic that I know is near and dear to all of our hearts in this room.
Student group, Students for Responsible Research, circulated a petition blasting the agreement for, quote, standing in direct conflict with our mission as a public university. The Daily Californian Berkeley's student newspaper, published a 5-part series on the growing privatization of the university, and a coalition of public interest groups sent a letter to Berkeley's chancellor, Robert Berdahl, charging that the alliance would, quote, disqualify a leading intellectual center from the ranks of institutions able to provide the kind of research free from vested interest that is the hallmark of academic life. Meanwhile, Gordon Rausser, the dean of the College of Natural Resources, sent a message to all professors urging them not to speak to the press and to direct any questions about the agreement to the university's public relations office. Many viewed the memo as a hush order. We are here to discuss the position of the faculty, Ignacio Chapela, a professor of microbial ecology, announced at the April 13th meeting. Chapela, who was then serving as the elected chairman of the college's executive committee, a faculty governing body, snapped on an overhead projector to display the results of the survey. The Novartis agreement has left the College of Natural Resources deeply divided, he declared. Although 41% of the faculty respondents supported the agreement as signed, more than 50% believed that it would have a negative or strongly negative effect on academic freedom. Roughly half believed that the agreement would erode Berkeley's commitment to, quote, public good research. And 60% feared that it would impede the free exchange of ideas among scientists within the college, one of Chapela's own concerns. When I came to Berkeley, Chapela explained to me after the meeting, the people who brought me here were my closest colleagues.
The reviews of University Inc. have characterized this publication as the most important contribution to the debate on the future of higher education. So congratulations again on this contribution. Some of the topics that she includes in many of her publications include the ethics controversies around publicly funded scientists moonlighting as paid consultants that manufacture the very drugs that these companies are testing. And universities are on slippery slope as they behave as research arms of some of these private industries. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the University of Maryland. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a very kind, generous introduction. Thank you. Well, thanks to all of you for coming out. It's really makes it much more fun to do these events when lots of students and faculty do come out, because what really interests me is to really spark discussion and of these issues. So that's really why I wrote the book. So it's great that you're here. I thought I would start by just reading a very short section from the book, just to give you a little feel for what it reads like, and then I'd sort of do a more overview kind of discussion of the larger issues that I sort of take on in the book. So this comes from Chapter 1. On the afternoon of April 13th, 1999, a radiant spring day, the Berkeley campus hardly looked like the site of a raging